Excellent talk, Mike. I really like your idea of promoting what we do. I think that's a very valid point, that we pretty much downplay our successes to the point where it doesn't get the recognition it should. I'm going to change directions a little bit. Obviously, since I'm a hurricane guy, I'm going to talk about the issues involving the hurricane problem. And I'm going to call it Challenges in Achieving a Hurricane-Ready Nation. I'm really talking about improving our resilience and what it takes. What are some of the pitfalls that we've run into of not getting there just yet? And my basic premise is we've made some significant improvements in the forecast, significant improvements in the timeliness of warnings and the amount of lead time people have and the visualizations. Plenty of information out there to improve decision-making for evacuations. It's hard for me to imagine people that don't have information about a hurricane when it approaches land. I also am very optimistic that further research is going to crack the nut on some of the issues that are still outstanding, especially with regard to rapid changes of intensity, which one of my biggest nightmares when I was at the Hurricane Center was having a hurricane rapidly intensify unexpectedly right before landfall. Much like what Patricia did off the coast of Mexico. That can happen in the Gulf of Mexico just as easily, and someday it probably will. But I think we will make some progress on that. And it's important that we keep working towards that, because that's how we can, A, reduce the loss of life even further, and B, by having more confidence in the forecast and shrinking the area that we have to have under evacuation decisions, disrupt the lives of fewer people than we have to now in the process. But I contend that if we could make the best forecast possible, the hurricane's still going to come and the damage is still going to be very great, because we're not yet in the resilience mode on how we develop our coastal communities. So we'll get started here. Let's see. I use for definition of resilience. A lot of people use the word resilience and have different definitions and meanings of it. I like to use the one that the National Academy of Sciences produced there. The ability to prepare and plan for, that's the preparedness part of it. Absorb, that's what we would call a response to when the hurricane hits. Recover from, and they added more successfully adapt to the adverse events. What I'm going to talk about in the short time that I have here are these particular challenges, the ones involving human nature, which I think are the biggest ones. Even some of the other ones are tied to those same challenges. The land use resilience, are we using the land properly? Or can we do better than what we're doing now? And then infrastructure, I mean like your schools, your roads, your police, your fire, your hospitals, nursing homes, retirement homes, things like that. And then your basic residential component that we see get damaged every time there's a major event. Denial, not just a river in Africa. We all have it. Denial is probably what keeps us sane. If we sat there expecting all the bad things that could happen to us and living in fear of those, we wouldn't do anything. So we go into denial on a lot of them. 35% of all marriages end in divorce. For those of you that were married, did you have in your wedding vows, till death or divorce do us part? No. So we're in a little bit of denial sometimes when we get married. It won't happen to me. Isn't that right? It won't happen to me. I won't end up in a divorce. We still have 20% of adults using tobacco. In light of all the science that shows that this is probably not a good thing for the quality of your life and the longevity of your life. But you are not going to get those that still use tobacco say, yeah, I know I'm going to end up with a very bad disease and die very young from it. They're in the denial mode that, well, it may not happen to me. 55% of adults don't have wills. What do we, more than half of us think we aren't going to die? And there's a lot of lawyers making a ton of money on people who die without a will to help settle the estate after the fact. But more important to what I'm talking about are the, let's see if this, oh, that's not what I wanted to do, is it? Wrong button. Who's working the recovery mode on the program here? Is there someone working the computer? Yeah, let's get it back up there. Something happened when I hit that. Okay, we're back there. More pertinent to what I'm talking about is this kind of denial. This is a highway, a major highway in downtown Houston after about 10 inches of rain. Well, as Mike pointed out, well forecasted. It was forecasted days in advance. The watch went out well in advance of the first raindrops falling, and the warnings preceded the flooding by quite a few hours. And actually, it was one that you could predict very well. Local officials, the TV meteorologists were all saying, they weren't saying only drive if you absolutely must. They were saying don't drive, stay where you are until the floodwaters recede. Yet, here we go. All over Houston, you had examples of people doing benefit for the car dealerships because all these cars are ruined. I think we had 7 people lose their lives, and they were all in cars that got flooded. Those people probably knew there was a warning in Vought. They absolutely had to know it was raining because the storm was huge over the whole city when they went out in there, but they had, it's not going to happen to me. I'm going to go where I need to go. Or this example. This is the Bolivar Peninsula, which is the other side of Galveston Channel from Galveston Island. That the eye wall of Hurricane Ike came across here, and about a 12-foot storm surge with wave action on top of it came through. The highest piece of land on the Bolivar is 6 feet. This is speaking of a land use issue. This is a classic example. Anyway, all but this last house standing here was pretty much wiped out where the core of the storm surge went through here. Yet we found out afterwards that less than half of the homeowners had flood insurance. I mean, what part of this picture am I missing here that why people didn't think they needed it? And because they were mostly built on stilts, they were outside the 100-year flood event, so it would have been cheap. We're talking hundreds of dollars, not thousands, for the flood insurance. And oh, by the way, the Bolivar is being rebuilt with even more expensive houses today than the ones that were wiped out in Hurricane Ike, and the highest piece of land is now 4 feet, not 6 feet, because of the scouring that Ike did. Land use issues. Another human factor is a communication issue. I had no idea this could happen to me, and I'm sure you've seen that in newspaper articles. Every major event we have, I would capture one of these, and I've got it in my different slideshows. I use a different one each year with the newest version of "It Couldn't Happen to Me." I didn't think this could happen to me. I'm not quite sure who all the they are, but they told me I wasn't in a floodplain. Your real estate guy, if you're not in the 100-year floodplain, is not going to tell you you need flood insurance. It's an on-off switch at the 100-year event. Even though you may be 1 foot above the 100-year event, you're told you don't need flood insurance. What they really should be told is you're not required to have it, but oh, by the way, you're pretty close to water here, and you could flood someday if you have a bigger storm than the 100-year event. Nobody says that. I've had that personally happen when I bought a house in Galveston County. I was told I didn't need flood insurance, which is a corollary of that one. This actually happened in Hurricane Irene. A state emergency management facility was flooded. Emergency manager told me at a conference that I was talking at is, we built our facility above the floodplain. I don't think so. You got washed away by the flood. What he really didn't understand was they had built, per code, they had built it above the 100-year floodplain. The 100-year floodplain is causing us a great deal of heartburn and loss of property. And my favorite one that gets my shackles raised is it was just a tropical storm, or it was only a Category 1. Look in the glossary of meteorology and see if the word justa or only show up in front of these terms. It doesn't. Tropical Storm Allison in 2001 did over $10 billion worth of damage and killed over 50 people. At its strongest point, it had 45-mile-an-hour winds. Just a tropical storm. It also produced a ton of rain in Louisiana and Texas. Or only a Cat 1. Hurricane Isaac that made landfall here several years ago did billions of dollars worth of damage. Was it only a Category 1? Hurricane Ike, which is the third costliest hurricane on record, was only a Category 2 at landfall. Please don't use that term when we're talking about hurricanes and tropical storms when they're making landfall. Complacency, shifting gears away from the denial mode into another human thing. Complacency is another human characteristic. I'm going to start over here on the right. This is the light blue is the people who make it a part of their life. Preparedness is something they do as a matter of their daily living, and they practice it year-round. The dark black there, I guess it is represents they're thinking about doing something about it. The green is they're working on it, and the dark blue is it's not even on their radar. They're not thinking about it and have no plans to do anything about it. And I don't know if this is true. This is a FEMA study done in 2014, but a Mason-Dixon poll that a fellow named Art Carlson had done every year as part of a piece he did that we used at the hurricane season, at the Hurricane Center when we rolled out the hurricane season on June 1st, found similar results to this. So it's something I've known about for a long time, but less than half the people do anything in the way of preparedness. This is not just hurricanes. It's any kind of preparedness. They do nothing. Only 1 out of 6 families have made it a part of their lives, and the rest are somewhere in between on making it do. We don't do the preparedness. You're not going to be some of the aspects of what the hurricane does when it strikes is something you might be ready for, and I think that plays a role in those that do lose their lives in hurricanes. Because they haven't prepared, they don't know what to do when the hurricane comes and get caught before it's too late to get out of harm's way. Perceived barriers to preparedness. A quarter of the people surveyed thought it was too expensive. I think they're thinking in terms of expensive shutters and things like that maybe put your basic preparedness, whether you need to evacuate or stay at home, can be done on just about anyone's economy. I could defy anyone to show me why it would cost something they can't afford to do. They don't know how to get prepared. Now, at least in my experience, almost every community along the coast and the counties along the coast have as part of their city documents and websites, they have pamphlets and information on how to get prepared, what the role of the city is, what the role of the citizen is when we have an approaching hurricane. So the information is out there. Maybe they don't know how to get it, which falls into this believing getting the information is too hard. And then there's a chunk that say they don't think they have time to prepare. Again, not knowing what they were thinking about on the question there. Sure enough, if you haven't prepared and the hurricane's approaching, you do not have enough time to actually prepare. You're going to be in a rush reacting to the events as they occur rather than acting on your preparedness plan. Okay. Evacuation. Evacuation is a very complicated human challenge. Most people don't want to evacuate. Why would I want to leave my perfectly comfortable home and everything I'm familiar with to get in that? The gridlock that shows up in the big cities. In the Houston-Galveston area where I live, there's 1 million people live in the evacuation zones. 1 million people. Guess where the evacuation routes go? Right through the city of Houston. So it's never a fun thing to do, even if it goes off without a hitch. This was in Rita. It didn't go off. It went off with a big hitch, so it didn't work right. But in Ike, it was done correctly. It still took people 10 hours to get inland. When that's there. So first you got to convince people they got to do it, and then they have to be prepared with their cars and their supplies and all that in order to make that move. And a lot of work goes into trying to educate people throughout the ramp up to the hurricane season of the importance for that. Well, what's been happening is in recent decades, there's been no significant increase in the capacity of highways, certainly since Katrina. And not just Houston area, all along the coast, we haven't added to the interstate, the laneage on the highway. So there's a certain amount of cars per hour. You know how many cars you're showing, you can tell them how fast they're actually going to move going down that highway. The more you get, the slower it goes. So the population's growing. There's almost 1 million more people in the Houston area, 200,000 more in the evacuation zone since Katrina. More people, no more lanes equals increased clearance time. They're already having to decide at 48 hours before landfall to make an evacuation for a major hurricane in a lot of our bigger population centers along the coast. The weather is fine at 48 hours. The skies are sunny and clear. The wind isn't blowing. There's a lot of uncertainty in people's mind. Do I really need to leave? So increasing that clearance time means having to go even farther out in time to make these decisions, and it becomes harder and harder to get a successful evacuation. Okay, land use and surge area. Well, what happens at the coast? We have big cities and we have ports. Ports are along the water. Ports become part of the problem because they're vulnerable to storm surge. They're down at the water's edge. In addition to that, in many of our areas, especially here in Texas and Louisiana, all that industry that people don't want anywhere else, known as the petrochemical world, is built out into the very low country right along the coast here. So we have a huge, very critical industry situated along the coastal zone. There are 250 petrochemical plants in the storm surge zone in the Houston-Galveston area, 250, and it's still growing. To me, it doesn't make sense to put medical and elderly care facilities in a storm surge zone unless you're building up above the surge area, because when you have to evacuate people who are already frail in health, you're going to lose some lives just moving them. So you got the uncomfortable position if you operate that facility of you move them, some are going to die. You stay here and the storm comes, some are going to die. I would hate to have to be put in that position, but if you took care and didn't have this situation, which is what a nursing home over here in Chalmette looked like after it was destroyed, we could reduce the loss. It'd become more resilient in how we take care of our elderly and sick people. And of course, the housing part is our fault. We all want to live, a lot of us that come down the coastal areas want to live near the water, so wherever there's land near water, you see neighborhoods developed. And you can just tell from this aerial shot that this place is doomed when storm surge comes in. Okay. Why Sandy and Katrina disasters are inevitable in spite of better forecasts. And I alluded to that at the start of the talk on the not changing our building practices. The land use is key to the 100-year event. And in spite of some efforts that have been made over the past to try to get Congress to enact legislation to increase maybe the level of risk that you are required to have flood insurance, that has failed. The lending industry doesn't seem to be too worried about it. It doesn't happen often enough that they don't lose enough money on people that get flooded. Because what happens is, let's say you're at the 200-year level, you don't have flood insurance, a 500-year storm comes in, and your house sustains $150,000 in flood damage. You don't have flood insurance. You get nothing to pay for that damage to be repaired. You don't have $150,000 in the bank. Your job went away. You throw the keys because you're no longer able to pay the mortgage, and it becomes the bank's. And apparently not enough of that happens to make the mortgage industry think, we require everyone to have fire insurance. Anyone here have a mortgage without fire insurance? I've never found anyone that does. I certainly haven't. The average single-family house has a 1 in 2,000 chance of burning down in a fire. Yet your lending company requires you to have insurance for that. Many of our houses have a somewhere less than 1 in 500 risk of flooding, and no one requires you to have the requisite insurance. Katrina and Sandy are much greater than 100-year events. The state climatologist in New Jersey published a study that suggested Sandy was a 700-year event. I've not seen a similar report on Katrina, but the storm surge was by far the largest we've ever seen, so I'm sure it's in that same ballpark. The value of property placed in harm's way has gone up exponentially. 1950, the average single-family house was less than 1,000 square feet. My father was a chemical engineer. The house I grew up in was built in 1950, and it was 1,200 square feet. We were probably a little above average as far as family income, so we could afford a slightly bigger than average house. Even had 4 bedrooms in it. It was more like 3 large closets and a master bedroom. Can you imagine that, 4 bedrooms and 1,000 square feet? I don't know if anyone even builds a single-family house at that scale anymore. Now, we're approaching 2,500 square feet. There aren't more people per family. We're running about the same on that. But you've got that big house, so what do? You got to fill it with stuff. What happens to stuff when the roof blows off? The water comes in and all your stuff gets ruined. That's where a lot of the damage occurs, is water penetration after wind has destroyed either the windows or part of the roof. And because instead of 900 square feet of property getting ruined, we're up around 2,500 square feet. And as an aside here, the building codes that are being proposed represent a minimum standard. And as one of the things we learned, I don't know how many of you saw this in the Dallas tornadoes, where building codes are fine to talk about, but if they're not followed, bad things happen. The school and many of the houses that Tim Marshall, as you mentioned, surveyed there, did not practice anywhere close to what are considered good building practices or good building codes in today's housing. And I think that problem is more widespread. You don't see it. Once the house is put together, you don't see the fact that it wasn't anchored properly, wasn't bolted. You don't have the clips. The roof wasn't the proper roof. It all looks just as good as a house that was built that way. And as an example, this is Max had these pictures up this morning, so I'll use them use them again because they're such a great example. Hurricane Charley hit the Port Charlotte, Florida area with about 140 mile an hour winds. This house had the windows blown in and a good chunk of the roof blown off. It was pre-Hurricane Andrew, so it didn't have the building codes of Hurricane Andrew. And it virtually ruined everything in the house, obviously, once the wind and water got in there. Within sight of this house is this house here. Now, Max said there was no damage, but if you look carefully, there are a few ridge tiles blown off and a fascia board here blown off, but otherwise, it's just superficial. There's no structural damage at all to the house built to the Miami-Dade Code. Miami-Dade Code house would probably cost you about 10% more than the house in the previous picture to build. And a little less than Miami-Dade house like mine. It's built, Miami-Dade would be about 140. Mine's built to 120, is about a 2% increase in cost, 2%. To build a house that can withstand 120 miles an hour wind versus 80 to 90. One of the other things that show up in engineering reports after every major hurricane is the single most effective and adaptive strategy to increase resiliency to wind is to have window coverings. If you can keep the wind and debris from blowing in your windows, the roof has a better chance of staying on and you're not getting water inside to damage your goods. Less than 10% of the people in Galveston County have window coverings. So, what can we do? It's obvious that from my experience, to me, it's obvious that we need to enact and enforce meaningful building codes on the new construction. There's not a whole lot you can do on retrofitting. You can, but it gets expensive, and I think expecting people to do that is a pipe dream. They have other things they need to spend their money on, so it's going to be hard to get that. But every year we go where we're building houses that are going to fall down in even a Category 2 or 3 hurricane, and a bigger one comes in, it's going to go even faster, increases our amount of damage in the area. I would require flood insurance up to the 500-year event, preferably through the mortgage companies wanting to have it, since I don't think there's much chance of getting legislation to that effect. I'm in between the 500 and the nominal 1,000-year event, and yet I got flood insurance. The kind of range you get in Texas, you just never know what might happen down there, and I'd rather have the peace of mind for a few $100s a year. Require the new critical infrastructure to be built to withstand a probable worst-case scenario. I'm actually seeing some of that in the post-Ike, where they're building the fire stations elevated and wind-coated to as much as 170 miles an hour, so that the critical stuff that you need to get back Humpty Dumpty back together will still be there when the storm passes. Didn't talk anything about storm surge protection systems like what we have here in Louisiana, but there are a number of places along the coast of the U.S. Let's face it, we've already built out a lot of the coastal areas here, and they're vulnerable. If there's a way to build a storm surge flood protection system, it certainly should be looked at, because the I think if you do the cost-benefit analyses, you're going to find that it's, in the long run, you're doing yourself a big favor by protecting yourself from the storm surge. And lastly, develop a culture of preparedness. Now, assuming we get all this done right, you've got your preparedness plan together and everything's cool, now you can go down to Grand Cayman and enjoy the day. I guess Grand Cayman didn't make it in here. There it is. Thank you very much.